There comes a moment in many people's lives when they realize that the person they've betrayed the most was never a friend, a partner, or a family member. It was themselves. Self-abandonment is a quiet, invisible wound. It doesn't announce itself with drama or noise. It appears in the subtle ways we shrink, silence our needs, overextend ourselves, or tolerate what breaks us. Psychologically, self-abandonment is the act of disconnecting from your own inner world, your emotions, desires, boundaries, intuition, and sense of worth. It is one of the most common yet most misunderstood forms of suffering because it often masquerades as kindness, loyalty, or strength. But in truth, it is a slow erosion of the self. Today, we explore the psychology behind why people abandon themselves, how it happens, and what it reveals about the human mind. Many people who struggle with self-abandonment don't realize that the root of their behavior was planted long before they ever had the language to describe it. When a child grows up in an environment where their emotions are dismissed, minimized, mocked, or punished, the mind receives a very clear message: your feelings are wrong, your needs are inconvenient, your inner world is unacceptable. And because children depend entirely on caregivers for survival, not just physically, but emotionally, they adapt in the only way they know how, by disconnecting from themselves to stay connected to others. This is the earliest form of self-abandonment. The moment a child learns that who they naturally are is unsafe to express. A child who is repeatedly told to stop crying, don't be dramatic, you're too sensitive, or you shouldn't feel that way, learns to shut down their emotional responses. At first, the abandonment is external. The caregiver abandons the child emotionally. But soon, the child internalizes this pattern and begins to abandon themselves. They stop trusting their own feelings because those feelings brought rejection or shame. Instead, they try to become what the environment demands: quiet, agreeable, undemanding, and emotionally invisible. This adaptation is not a conscious choice, it's a survival instinct. The child learns that the safest self is a muted one. What makes this psychological wound so profound is that self-abandonment becomes normalized. The child doesn't grow up thinking, my needs were neglected. Instead, they grow up believing, my needs are not important. The difference is enormous. One points to the parent's failure. The other points to the child's perceived flaw. Over time, the child stops looking inward for guidance and begins scanning the world for cues on how to behave, what to feel, and who to be. This early disconnection creates adults who are hyper, aware of other people's emotions but deeply disconnected from their own. The emotional suppression learned in childhood becomes the foundation for adult self-neglect. These individuals struggle to identify what they truly want because they've spent years being rewarded for hiding their desires. They feel guilty when they speak up because they were conditioned to believe that expressing needs is selfish or burdensome. Even positive emotions, like excitement or pride, may feel unsafe because they weren't validated when they were young. So the adult continues to do what the child learned to do: silence themselves to keep the peace. This internal abandonment also shapes relationships. People who learned early that their feelings didn't matter often choose partners or friends who repeat the same dynamic. It feels familiar. It feels normal. The adult may find themselves apologizing for having needs, tolerating disrespect, or staying quiet during conflict, all because their nervous system still responds as if expressing themselves is dangerous. They may even feel discomfort when someone actually treats them well, because nurturing environments feel foreign, not comforting. The tragedy is that the original abandonment was never the child's fault, yet they grow up believing it was. But the mind is powerful. The patterns that were formed as a survival strategy can be unlearned. Healing begins when a person turns inward and acknowledges the parts of themselves they were forced to leave behind. It begins with recognizing that their emotions always mattered, but no one taught them how to honor them. People who grow up abandoning themselves often become experts at focusing on everyone else's needs while completely neglecting their own. This behavior doesn't emerge from generosity alone. It develops because, early in life, they learned that being helpful, agreeable, and accommodating was the safest way to exist. When their own feelings were dismissed or punished, they discovered that attention, approval, and affection were given only when they were useful. So they build an identity around being the caretaker, the peacekeeper, the fixer, the one who sacrifices silently so that others remain comfortable. The tragedy is that beneath this selfless exterior lies a person who is starving emotionally, yet unable to feed themselves. Their self-worth becomes deeply entangled with how much they can give. If they are not supporting someone, they fear they have no value. They are constantly scanning for emotional needs in others because they were trained to ignore their own. They feel responsible for other people's moods, stress, and comfort, often feeling compelled to jump in before anyone even asks. This hyper-focus on others becomes a coping mechanism. It distracts them from the discomfort they feel within themselves. Caring for others becomes a way to avoid caring for themselves because facing their own needs feels unfamiliar or frightening. Over time, this habit becomes a psychological pattern known as functional self-abandonment. Outwardly, they appear strong, dependable, and selfless. Internally, they are empty and exhausted. They give, and give not because they always want to, but because the act of giving has become tied to their identity and their sense of safety. Saying no feels dangerous. Setting boundaries feels like a betrayal. Choosing themselves feels selfish. They've learned to ignore their exhaustion and push past their limits because they don't believe their limits matter. Even in relationships, they tend to gravitate toward people who take more than they give. These relationships feel familiar because they echo the early dynamic where the child had to prioritize the caregiver. These individuals often attract emotionally needy or self-centered partners because they are so used to carrying emotional burdens. And when they do express a need, even a simple one, they feel guilty or anxious, as if they're disrupting the natural order of things. The deeper truth is that focusing on others' needs gives them a sense of purpose that they struggle to find within. It keeps them from confronting the uncomfortable question, what do I want? Because the truth is, they don't know. They were never encouraged to ask themselves. Instead, they built a life based on pleasing, performing, and adjusting. But the mind and body eventually rebel against chronic self-neglect. Burnout, resentment, emotional numbness, and even anxiety or depression can emerge. These symptoms are not signs of weakness, they are signals. Signals that their internal world is tired of being ignored. Healing this pattern requires learning that their needs are not burdens, that their worth does not depend on usefulness, and that their own inner life deserves as much attention as they've always given to others. People who fall into self-abandonment are often driven by a silent and persistent fear of rejection. This fear isn't always loud or dramatic, it can be subtle, woven into their daily behavior in ways they don't even recognize. They may act confident, agreeable, or easygoing on the outside, but inside they constantly monitor how others perceive them. Every decision, every action, and every word is filtered through the question, will this make someone pull away from me? Because to them, rejection doesn't just mean losing a person, it feels like losing safety, identity, and emotional stability. This fear usually originates from childhood dynamics where love felt unpredictable or conditional. If caregivers were inconsistent, critical, or emotionally unavailable, the child learned that acceptance must be earned. They internalized the idea that being themselves was risky, so they shaped their personality around what others wanted. This early environment programs the nervous system to be hyper, attuned to social cues. A slight change in tone, delayed response, or neutral face can trigger anxiety because it feels like a threat of abandonment. Over time, this sensitivity becomes so ingrained that they no longer see it as fear, it simply becomes who they are. To avoid rejection, they become experts at shrinking themselves. They suppress emotions, silence their needs, and avoid conflict even when boundaries are crossed. They convince themselves that it's better to stay quiet than risk upsetting someone. They'll agree to things they don't want, tolerate mistreatment, and remain in draining relationships not because they lack awareness, but because the fear of being discarded feels worse than discomfort. They would rather endure pain than face the feeling of being unwanted. This fear also shapes their communication. They speak softly, apologize unnecessarily, or over-explain to make sure no one misunderstands them. They second-guess their own feelings before expressing them, asking themselves if they are too much, too sensitive, or too demanding. They may anticipate criticism and preemptively adjust their behavior to avoid it. Even when they finally express a need, they do so timidly, bracing for the possibility of being dismissed. Ironically, this constant effort to avoid rejection leads them to abandon the one person who should never be rejected themselves. In prioritizing others' comfort over their own authenticity, they create a self-fulfilling prophecy. They feel invisible, unheard, and unimportant because they treat themselves that way. They fear rejection so deeply that they end up rejecting their own feelings before anyone else can. The path to healing requires recognizing that the fear is a memory, not a truth. It's an emotional echo of a time when love was unstable, not a reflection of their worth today. As they slowly learn to tolerate small moments of authenticity, saying no, expressing needs, disagreeing calmly, they begin to experience something revolutionary. Real connection doesn't disappear when they show up as themselves. And with each small step, the fear of rejection loses its power. People who self-abandon often struggle deeply with setting boundaries because they were conditioned to believe that boundaries are dangerous, that saying no, expressing discomfort, or asserting personal limits will push people away. This belief is not born out of stubbornness or weakness. It comes from lived experiences where boundaries were punished, ignored, or shamed. When someone grows up in an environment where their needs were dismissed or treated as an inconvenience, they learn to associate self-protection with conflict and conflict with rejection. So instead of protecting themselves, they choose compliance, thinking it will keep them safe. For these individuals, boundaries feel like a risk to connection. They believe they must remain endlessly available, forgiving, and accommodating to be accepted. If someone asks for too much, they say yes. If someone violates their comfort, they stay silent. If someone hurts them, they rationalize it. Their inner world is guided by the fear that any form of resistance will make them difficult or unlovable. They internalize a dangerous narrative. Other people's needs matter more than their own, and prioritizing themselves is selfish. As a result, they become chronic overgivers, constantly pouring out emotional, mental, and physical energy with very little in return. This difficulty with boundaries also leads to distorted self-worth. They start to believe that they only have value when they are being useful. Their identity becomes tied to caretaking, problem-solving, or emotional labor. They feel responsible for other people's happiness and guilty for having needs of their own. When someone is upset, they rush to fix it. When someone oversteps, they convince themselves it wasn't a big deal. Their entire sense of belonging becomes dependent on keeping others comfortable at their own expense. Internally, this creates an exhausting emotional conflict. They want to feel seen and respected, but they are terrified to do the very things that would allow that to happen. A part of them longs for healthy boundaries, yet another part fears the consequences of setting them. This inner split creates anxiety, resentment, and a quiet grief, the grief of never experiencing relationships where they feel safe enough to be themselves. What makes this pattern truly painful is that their lack of boundaries often attracts people who benefit from it: takers, users, manipulators, or emotionally immature partners. These individuals reinforce the belief that boundaries will lead to abandonment. And every time they suppress their needs to maintain peace, they strengthen the internal message that their voice is secondary. Healing begins when they start recognizing that boundaries are not walls, they are doors. Boundaries don't push people away, they filter who should have access. They don't destroy relationships, they protect healthy ones and expose harmful ones. When someone begins practicing small boundaries, they slowly discover that the people who truly care will not punish them for having limits. They will listen, adjust, and respect them. And this is the moment when they realize that boundaries were never the problem, the environments that rejected them were. Many people who struggle with self-abandonment often become chronic people pleasers, not because they are naturally submissive or weak, but because at some point in their life, pleasing others became a method of emotional survival. They learned early that approval is safety, compliance is acceptance, and harmony, even if forced, is more important than honesty. Pleasing becomes a psychological shield, a way to avoid conflict, rejection, disappointment, or emotional punishment. But while it protects them in the moment, it slowly erodes their sense of identity. For these individuals, seeking approval becomes an automatic reflex. They anticipate what others want before those desires are even spoken. They read facial expressions, tone, and mood shifts with hypersensitivity, adjusting their behavior instantly to avoid displeasing anyone. At first glance, they appear kind, flexible, and easygoing. But beneath that surface lies a painful truth. Their kindness is often rooted not in generosity, but in fear that being their true self will cost them the relationships they desperately want to preserve. This approval-seeking behavior creates a cycle of emotional dependence. They begin measuring their worth through external validation. Someone's smile, praise, gratitude, or acceptance becomes proof that they are good enough. If people are happy with them, they feel safe. If people are disappointed, even slightly, they feel like they've failed. This dependence keeps them constantly scanning others' reactions, living in a state of emotional tension, always trying to avoid doing the wrong thing. The tragedy is that pleasers rarely feel the same kindness they give. They say yes when they want to say no, but no one sees the inner conflict. They absorb emotional burdens that do not belong to them, but no one notices the weight. They comfort others while silently abandoning themselves. Over time, they become exhausted, burnt out, and disconnected from their true desires. They forget what they genuinely like, want, or believe because they've spent so long shaping themselves into what others find acceptable. Emotionally, they become fragile, not because they lack strength, but because their sense of self is built on unstable ground. When your identity depends on pleasing others, any rejection feels like a collapse. Any disagreement feels like a threat. Any unmet expectation feels like a failure. And because they fear losing people, they overextend themselves in relationships where their effort is not reciprocated. This makes them targets for manipulative, selfish, or emotionally draining individuals who benefit from the imbalance. Yet beneath this pattern lies an important truth. Pleasers are not trying to deceive or manipulate. They act from a place of deep longing, the longing to feel valued, loved, and accepted without conflict. Their real pain comes from believing that their true self is not enough. The journey toward healing begins when they start reclaiming the parts of themselves they've denied. It begins when they offer themselves the approval they've always chased externally. And it grows stronger when they realize that real love doesn't require disappearing, it requires showing up as a whole, imperfect, authentic human being. Many people who experience self-abandonment often struggle with emotional boundaries, not because they don't want to protect themselves, but because they were never taught that they had the right to. Boundaries require a sense of personal worth, the belief that your feelings matter, that your time matters, and that your emotional space deserves respect. But for someone who has practiced self-abandonment for years, that sense of worth has been compromised. They feel guilty for saying no, ashamed for needing space, and afraid that asserting themselves will push people away. So, instead of expressing their limits, they stay silent, endure discomfort, and internalize pain that should have been addressed openly. Weak or non-existent boundaries often stem from early environments where saying no was punished, ignored, or dismissed. Many grew up believing that their needs were too much, their emotions inconvenient, or their desires selfish. So, as adults, they default to the same patterns, tolerating disrespect, absorbing emotional demands, and sacrificing their well-being to maintain peace. Over time, this creates relationships where they give far more than they receive, not because they truly want to, but because they don't know how to protect themselves without feeling like they're harming someone else. This lack of boundaries leads to chronic emotional fatigue. When a person constantly suppresses their discomfort to avoid conflict, they end up carrying emotional burdens that slowly drain their energy. They agree to commitments they didn't want. They listen to problems they don't have the capacity for. They stay in conversations, friendships, or relationships that overwhelm them. They become the emotional sponge for everyone around them. And because they rarely speak up, others assume they're fine. The world interprets their silence as agreement, their compliance as comfort, and their endurance as strength, when in reality, they are quietly unraveling. Internal chaos grows when external boundaries are weak. Resentment builds silently, turning into frustration, exhaustion, or emotional numbness. The person begins to feel invisible, not because others don't care, but because they've unintentionally taught people to overlook their needs. When you never say no, people assume you don't have limits. When you don't express discomfort, others assume you're comfortable. When you never push back, the world assumes you don't mind being pushed. A deeper psychological wound emerges from this pattern, the belief that protecting yourself is wrong. They begin to see themselves as less deserving of rest, respect, or reciprocity. They rationalize mistreatment. They excuse harmful behaviors. They tell themselves that advocating for their needs is selfish, while giving endlessly is noble. But true self-worth cannot grow in a life without boundaries. Without emotional walls, everything enters the good, the bad, the draining, and the destructive. Healing starts with understanding that boundaries are not barriers to love. They are expressions of self-respect. Setting limits does not push healthy people away. It filters out those who only valued you for your compliance. When someone begins reclaiming their boundaries, they often fear losing people. Yet the truth is powerful. The relationships that survive your boundaries are the ones aligned with your healing, and the ones that don't were built on your self-abandonment, not your authenticity. Many people who struggle with self-abandonment often lose touch with their authentic identity because they have spent years shaping themselves around the expectations, desires, and emotional needs of others. When you're constantly adjusting your personality to fit in, constantly silencing your thoughts to keep peace, constantly performing the version of yourself that others want rather than the one that feels true, you begin to forget who you really are. Identity becomes blurry, unstable, confusing. The person may know how to please, how to agree, how to adapt, but they don't know how to be themselves. Their preferences feel uncertain, their boundaries unclear, and their inner voice faint. They may say things like, "I don't even know what I like anymore," or "I don't know who I am without other people." This is not weakness, it's the psychological consequence of a life spent prioritizing external approval over internal truth. When someone abandons themselves long enough, they begin to live through others' expectations. What their parents wanted shapes their decisions. What their partner prefers influences their personality. What society praises determines their behavior. And because they believe that being accepted depends on meeting these external demands, they suppress any part of themselves that might cause disagreement or separation. As a result, their authentic identity doesn't disappear, it simply goes underground, buried beneath layers of compliance and emotional survival strategies. Instead of expressing who they are, they become who they feel safest being. This identity suppression creates deep inner conflict. On the surface, they may appear agreeable, calm, flexible, easygoing, the kind of person who doesn't make things difficult. But internally, there is a silent emotional rebellion. Their real self is pushing against the constraints of constant self-sacrifice, wanting to be seen, heard, and valued. The more they ignore this inner voice, the more fragmented they feel. They begin to notice that their reactions don't match their true feelings. Their choices don't reflect their true desires, and their life path feels strangely disconnected from their inner truth. This inner split is exhausting. It takes immense emotional energy to deny yourself every day. Over time, living as someone else erodes a person's sense of worth. When your identity is shaped entirely by what others want, you internalize the message that who you truly are isn't enough. You start believing that your real self is unlovable, inconvenient, or too much. This belief keeps the cycle of self-abandonment alive. You hide yourself to be accepted, but hiding yourself is what reinforces the belief that your true self is unworthy. It's a loop that quietly undermines confidence, resilience, and emotional stability. Healing begins when the person realizes that reclaiming their identity is not selfish, it's essential for psychological well-being. Authenticity is not a luxury, it is a psychological need. Even small acts of honesty, choosing what you genuinely prefer, expressing a real opinion, acknowledging your true feelings begin to rebuild the internal connection that was lost. Over time, they discover that their real self was never broken, just hidden. And as they reconnect with it, relationships become more meaningful, decisions become clearer, and life feels more aligned with who they truly are. This process of reclaiming identity is the opposite of self-abandonment. It is self-return, self-recognition, and ultimately, self-liberation.